Last fall, by any measure, we witnessed a historic presidential election, the results of which continue to put a special light on the work of the media and on all those who aspire to be future newsmakers, storytellers, truth seekers of our world. America is vulnerable to fake news and so-called alternative facts because we live in a world in which words matter little and ideas matter less. Indeed, our access to content is so swift and uncurated, it is less knowable, less verifiable, and more relativistic, more akin to reality television, which is not real at all, but rather a fictionalized, rehearsed, directed, staged, and edited documentation. It is representational only, a shadow, sometimes a dark shadow, of what is true. In this disintermediated environment in which our insatiable appetite to obliterate the distance between I want it and I have it is much in evidence. Truth is no longer an absolute. Tweets and retweets and numbers of followers one may have are privileged over analysis, discernment, and judgment. Critical thinking especially is in very short supply as we want news or entertainment masquerading as news sometimes, that affirms our beliefs, theories, and predispositions rather than news that might take us outside the narrow confines of where they are comfortably housed. Social media algorithms create affinity groups, and by tapping in an icon with a comforting smiley face, we express our agreement with an idea, a petition, or a perspective with a like, as if doing so could be a suitable substitute for real conversation or substantive discussion. The reduction of ideas and language to the lowest common denominator is one of the great dangers of contemporary society. And whether we realize it or not, all of us, no matter our political leanings, left or right, contribute to this environment. It creates a fertile ground for fake news, especially with our cringe-worthy obsession for social media and celebrity culture. Social media in particular are wanted, subversive, revolutionary, and riotous, breaking free from the convention, always. They are what Bertrand Russell once remarked about ideas. They are destructive and terrible, merciless to privilege, established institutions, and comfortable habits. They are lawless, indifferent to authority, careless of the well-tried wisdom of the ages. We think it controls us. We think we control it, but it controls us. Just ask the newspaper reporter who wakes up in the middle of the night to check his Twitter feed so he might be among the first to read and then presumably the first to report on the latest Donald Trump tweet. So who is in control here? You know, we've arrived at that moment that Marshall McLuhan prophesied half a century ago. The medium has become the message. Or put another way, the medium controls the message. And this environment poses a very real challenge for journalists who presumably are charged with reporting facts and making clear distinctions between facts, speculation, and untruth. But as Jim Ruttenberg of the New York Times wrote in a penetrating and wonderfully honest and candid editorial during the run-up to the general election, he said, the question that everyone is grappling with is, do normal standards apply? And if they don't, what should take their place? We have the opportunity tonight to discuss this and many other salient topics, and I look very much forward to the insights and observations from our guest panelists. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Janet Wu. There's Janet. Who was an anchor and reporter for NBC, and more recently she has been teaching in Emerson's journalism department, and we are so fortunate to have her moderate our discussion tonight. Janet.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Good evening. 1 year ago, the terms fake news and alternative facts did not exist in our lexicon as they do today. This all was given rise during the election, and we now know false information promoted as real news was used to influence the election. Hillary Clinton was never found to have Parkinson's disease or ties to a human trafficking ring operating out of a pizza shop. President Trump was not diagnosed with a brain tumor discovered by a colonoscopy. You laugh, but people believe these things because this is information, stories that were written and spread by people and websites that admittedly produce fake news. And it's not just what we are reading on the internet. Since the inauguration, White House officials have referenced imagining massacres and numbers and information that cannot be verified. Let's take a look at the latest cover of Time magazine. Is truth dead? What can you believe? Who and what can you trust? And how is the changing relationship between journalism and government affecting our democracy? We have a distinguished panel of journalists and editors from all platforms to discuss these issues. I already apologized to them, saying it would take far too long to read out their full CVs, their accomplishments and awards, so I will introduce them by the roles that you know them best by and their media organizations. Tom Ashbrook, host of NPR's On Point. Katie Kingsbury, managing editor of digital content for the Boston Globe. Steve Adler, president and editor-in-chief of Reuters News Service. And Peter Casey, director of all news and programming for CBS Radio in Boston. You are so lucky. To get them all together on one stage is amazing. So take advantage and listen closely. Tom, we are going to start with you. Although you are based in Boston, you have traveled the country, and I know you travel the world for your interviews and forums. Is this truly the most divided you have ever seen this country politically, or does it just feel that way?
I guess it is, but it's not as though the country hasn't been divided before. I am old enough to remember the Vietnam era, when the country was very vigorously divided over the war, but I've never seen it as divided sort of wall to wall ideologically as it is now. And to the point that the fearless leader of Emerson made, and that you've been making with the colonoscopy and everything else, that bleeds directly these days into how people look at information, look at the news, what they accept, what they don't, what they're open to, what they're not open to. It creates a very strange environment for someone like me who's every day putting out, I hope, facts and listening to the response from callers on the radio. They come from such diverse points of view, and they're not necessarily open at all to the view of the other. I guess it is. I guess it is. Wall to wall, it's the most divided time.
So speaking of views, Katie, you won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary for the Boston Globe. Generally, we have come to think that op-ed writers take positions while their larger media outlets remain neutral. Now we are seeing larger media outlets take positions. Does this mean that neutrality is dead?
No, I don't think so. And in fact, I would actually disagree with the premise of the question that larger newsrooms are taking positions. I think that there are some newsrooms who have done that. The Boston Globe is not one of those. I think for a lot of journalists, actually, the day after the election was liberating because we knew what our job was. And that job hasn't changed, and it wouldn't have changed no matter who was elected to the White House. The Boston Globe is dedicated to being neutral. We are going to be tough on this president. We are going to be fair with this president. And we are going to be relentless in our reporting. And we would treat this administration the same way we would treat any administration, which is to tell essential truths, hold the powerful accountable. The difference here is that we are also have to be willing in both our reporting, but also outside of our work lives, to give this president a fair shot. We have to be willing to accept the fact that he might actually be creating a novel presidency. He might actually be able to fix some of the problems that have plagued the country with a divided Congress, for instance. And that, I think, for some journalists has been tougher given the attacks on the journalism by President Trump. At the same time, this is not a novel thought from me, but the president is not, media is not the enemy of the president. We are not the opposition party. We are opposed to misinformation, and that's what we're combating.
This is a good introduction to my next question for Steve. 11 days after the inauguration, you released this memo covering Trump the Reuters way. You issued this to your staff, but it went public, and then it was widely read. It went viral. What specifically led you to take this step?
You try to talk privately with your staff, and suddenly everybody knows about it. So that was within a couple of days of both the president saying that reporters were very dishonest people, and one of his chief advisors saying that the media was the opposition party. And what I was seeing was both a lot of confusion among the press about how to deal with this, because I don't think the U.S. media had dealt with something quite like this before. And also, I think, a desire by our staff to sort of hear what I had to say about it. So I wrote a staff memo. This was just a regular staff memo that leaked, and then we clearly made it public. And I was really interested in how many people wanted to read this, because I would assume, a typical staff memo will not get that many readers, but 650,000 people read it online. So clearly there was a lot of interest in thinking about this. And essentially what I was saying to the staff was, we're a global news organization, and I wasn't trying to equate President Trump with anybody else anywhere, but I was saying that we're accustomed to, in a 165-year history, of covering all sorts of leaders, and they don't necessarily like us, and they don't necessarily open up their press rooms for us, and they don't necessarily say nice things about us, but we have kind of a playbook for dealing with that, and I thought the playbook for the U.S. should be exactly the same as the playbook for elsewhere, which was essentially, don't spend a lot of time worrying about getting handouts, go out and get independent information. Don't turn it into a fight with the president. It's not about who's an opposition party. It's about doing our jobs to get good, fair, accurate information out there so people can make smarter decisions. Not to be intimidated, but also just not to pick fights and not to write so much about ourselves. I think the press got a little obsessed, perhaps, with writing a lot about our, the hardships we're facing. And all I was pointing out is all over the world, the media is in trouble, and sometimes in way more serious trouble than they are in here. So let's stay calm, do our jobs with integrity, get news out, and do our own reporting, do our own sourcing, which ultimately is the better way to do reporting anyway. And I think that resonated because a lot of people agreed with that.
And we should point out, in much of the world, there are much more personal danger. I do have to ask you as a follow-up, because the audience can read some of these points. What point would you add today? Is there anything you would add to this memo today, given the first 60 days of the administration?
I'd hate to say that I would keep every word exactly the way it was, but I think what's happened has largely confirmed that this is the way to do it, and I think we're trying very hard to stick to it. I think the one piece of it that's really hard, and that a lot of people in the room will probably disagree with, is the notion of having your personal view, but putting it aside. The notion that we are actually professionals, and we have a professional set of tools and expertise, and we're essentially the proxy for our readers. And they can't be out there reporting it, so they're hiring us essentially to be out there reporting it. And I think when we get our own personal feelings mixed up with it, we're not doing as good a job of using our professional skills to communicate in ways that people can then make use of as they choose. So I would double down on that thought particularly. Keep your personal views out.
To your point, we were talking backstage about how one major editor in the U.S. read or heard about your memo and what they took away from it, which is a very common. You might describe that because it's interesting.
So it's a kind of a lesson, and I tell journalists it's really good to be written about sometimes, because it really reminds you of how important it is to be careful, because you just hate reading stuff about yourself that isn't true. So I wrote the memo, and either left-wing or right-wing press took it and twisted it to fit their point of view. So either I was saying that Trump was the same as dictators in other countries that I named, and therefore I was saying covering Trump was essentially covering a dictator, and people either saw that as a positive thing or suggested I was ridiculously anti-Trump. And I never said that, but the leader of a major a U.S. news organization, called me up and said, I'm confused about why you wrote 2 memos. I read your memo, I agreed with it, and then I read that, in fact, you were saying that President Trump was the same as the worst dictator in the world, so you must have written a second memo. And I said, it was the same memo. It was just somebody had interpreted it and twisted it to their political end. And you know, until you've experienced that, I think as a journalist, you don't quite get how important it is to be accurate and fair.
And how difficult it is to come across that way. Peter, on last Sunday's 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley said, never before has so much information been available to so many people, and never before has so much bad information been available. Do you feel that the rising flow of information has actually hurt the clarity of what's out there, or as Lee Pelton referred to, is there just too much?
There is, I don't want to say there is too much. There's certainly plenty. But I put the challenge on the audience to be a better consumer of news and do as much research as you would for, or more. If you're going to research a restaurant and go to Yelp, I would do as much research on the news organization that you're going to use for your information and vet them before you believe everything you actually read. And I would also ask people to not just read the things that you agree with, not just listen to the things that you agree with. Do your own little opposition research and look for things that come from both ends of the perspective, from wherever you sit. The people sitting here on one side of the audience and the people sitting on the other side of the audience will each have a different perspective when they look at this panel based on where they're sitting. So I ask everybody, when I get a call from a listener, I ask all of them when they're saying, well, you were too far to the right on this or too far to the left, I ask them, okay, where were you sitting when you judge us and tell me that that story that you're complaining about was too far to the right or too far to the left? Where are you sitting when you begin to judge us?
So talking about what we are reading, let's see what you have been reading. We want to show you a screenshot now of a tweet that was sent out 5 days ago. The president tweeted this: just watch the totally biased and fake news reports of the so-called Russia story on NBC and ABC, such dishonesty. And he has, as you know, called the New York Times, NBC, CNN fake news. Tom, I want to hear your thoughts on this sort of devaluing of the press from the very top, as well as this overall decline in civil discourse.
When the President of the United States calls the press the enemy of the people, to me that's an attack on the First Amendment. And it's an attack on core American values. I want to be fair to this president, but I am prepared as a journalist to fight for those values and for the First Amendment, for the freedom of speech. To attack it from the top in this way is shocking to me, and it puts me in a real kind of dukes up frame of mind. At the same time, and we heard this earlier, I want to be open to Donald Trump if he has a different way that might work for this country. I want to be open to change if change might be healthy for this country. But if it's a change that requires the press to shut up and sit down, then to my mind there's something wrong at the beginning. On the third hand, it wasn't that many years ago that the press itself was talking about objectivity and how it was a false aspiration. It had always been the expressed goal of American journalism. But in the 90s, there was a lot of talk about how, come on, let's get real. This kind of deconstructionist, postmodern, POMO thinking about the press. Everyone comes with predispositions, predilections, presumptions. And to be fully objective is perhaps beyond human capacity. It's a kind of Platonic ideal that we can reach for, but it's hard to actually accomplish. Donald Trump tapped into something very deep in this country in the election that won him, ultimately not a majority, but it won him the election, which is a pretty big deal. And it is, the press needs to think about what that was. Did they miss that? Was there something in their view of the country that was blinkered? And do some real self-examination, a kind of a deep scrub on the clarity of their own vision. That is not the same as saying that Mr. Trump's vision is perfect or describes perfect objectivity, or that he, as the President of the United States, should be calling the press the enemy of the people. But self-examination is always a good thing. The press not excluded in any way from that. But enemy of the people, when a President of the United States starts talking that way, I, as a journalist, it's not personal, to your point. It's not that I want to make the press the point, but the president is not, he's personal and he's not. This is a fixed position constitutionally, and a very important position in our country. And to attack the press as the enemy of the people, I think demonstrates a misguided understanding of the vital role of a free press in our system. It doesn't mean the press should be exempt from self-examination.
So agreed. Self-examination from the press and the readers. What were you going to say, Katie?
I was just going to say, I think the bigger question becomes, how do you fight back against that? And how do you defend the First Amendment? And one of the ways to do it, and one of the ways that many large newsrooms have chosen to do it in the Trump era, is to make sure that we're always accurate, that we're always being fair, that we're always trying to tell the stories that perhaps we were missing before. And I think that there's been a lot of hand-wringing over the last few months by the media over, did we miss the Trump story? Did we miss the voices of the people in places like the Rust Belt that were not being told? I actually take a lot of issue with that. Almost every major media organization in this country did some kind of series that had a title like Anxious in America, America's Anxiety, America on Edge. We tried to tell those stories. I think the bigger question is, why didn't they resonate? Why didn't we reach a larger audience with them? Why were people able to dismiss them? Why didn't people feel like their voices were heard? And why do they feel like their stories weren't being heard and they chose to, elect someone who might actually be counter to their actual values and what they need from the government?
I think what's interesting to consider and there are outlets on this in the internet, to question and hear the responses of people that voted a certain way and to see how they feel now. I have had friends post on their Facebook or on Twitter, you voted for Trump, do you regret that? You voted for Hillary, what do you think now? Peter earlier said to examine where you sit when you react to something. And because we are sitting here in Boston, in New England, we have to bring up the bubble question. Do we live in a bubble? Do we not understand what the rest of the country is thinking? And Katie, because you're with the Globe, I want to bring up something that was published almost 1 year ago. On April 10th, 2016, the Boston Globe issued this controversial issue. I remember getting this and pausing for a while. This was what a Trump presidency would look like. In retrospect, and I'd love to hear some of the conversations leading up to this decision, was issuing fake news for the sake of being fake news the right decision?
I think context is important in this case. So this was the front page of the Sunday Ideas section almost exactly a year ago, as Janet pointed out. I was the editor of the Ideas section at the time. And this is satire. This was meant to be an exercise in satire that posed the question, if we took Donald Trump at his word, what would America look like? So every story on this page was based on a statement by the presidential candidate at the time. It was noted at the bottom of the page clearly that this was satire, that it was meant to be satire. It accompanied a very sternly worded editorial that asked the GOP to stop Donald Trump's rise in its party. It was marked as opinion, and very specifically, and especially if you got the print paper, it was quite obvious that it wasn't the front page of the newspaper. It was sometimes actually portrayed that way, which was one of those exercises in finding out what it's like to be reported on. But this was very clearly, we went out of our way to make sure that there wasn't that kind of confusion for our readers who were receiving this in their newspaper. There is a long, storied tradition of satire in American journalism. We still have some great satirists. Alexandra Petrie at the Washington Post was actually included in the White House daily briefing because one of her recent columns was so subtle that the White House didn't realize that they were being mocked by it. But there's a dramatic difference between an editorial page trying to make a statement through satire and fake news. Fake news lines someone's pockets or is done for sport, or a lot of the things that came out in the 60 Minutes interview over the weekend, which essentially, there's a reason that someone is doing that, spreading that kind of misinformation that is different than an act of journalism, which is what this piece of satire was.
But this got some pushback, did it not? How was the reaction?
I think the reaction actually really varied. It was celebrated by many people, actually. We got a lot of positive feedback. I think that there was confusion, and part of that was actually how it was portrayed in the media. I was actually interviewed by NPR on the Sunday morning that it came out.
Tough, probing interview.
It actually was. It was probably one of the hardest interviews that I did on this topic because the host sincerely was confused. She felt like this was the front page of the Boston Sunday Globe that day, which it was not. That
This is not fake news. This is not the
It's
issue.
not fake news at
This
all.
is
It's not
satire.
an issue at all.
Fake news is a big deal, and alternative facts are a big deal. This is not that. This is satire.
Right. Thank you,
Thank
Tom.
you. NPR speaks.
Yes.
A little late.
Thank you for that defense. But I think that we were doing this as a thought exercise. We wanted the American voters who were going into the voting booth to have a strong sense of the president that they were choosing when they were marking their ballot for Donald Trump. And I think one of the things that's pretty remarkable about this is that if you look at these headlines, they're remarkably correct.
Correct.
I
was gonna
we
say-
never thought this.
I know people that have saved this edition and consider the Globe incredibly, almost eerily prescient because of these headlines.
I think we actually went into this exercise thinking that we were too dark. Besides the markets, which, time will tell, a lot of these things have actually come to pass. And I think that is interesting because when we were actually writing this, we had no idea. We actually thought that we were exaggerating it for effect. But instead, many of these stories, while maybe we got some of the details wrong, the broad picture was fairly accurate. And that's something that actually worries me. It concerns me.
But some of the pushback, do you think that was because, I know one of my worries was that people don't take the time with the flow of information to go that next step of thought. They basically read, they absorb, they don't realize what's going on. That's where the misunderstanding came from. And is almost satire more difficult to do now because people aren't taking that pause and seeing something and understanding something for what it is?
I think that's something you have to take into consideration, but I also think that you have to give your readers some credit. You need to.
What month was this?
This was
April
April 2016.
So 6 months, 8 months before the election. I mean,
Yeah.
So-
So I feel like you can't assume that readers are not going to take the time to read your story. I think there are certain circumstances, absolutely, you have to be realistic about how people consume news, and those are tough conversations that our newsrooms are having. But I think that at the end of the day, you don't assume the lowest common denominator. You don't assume that people are not going to take the time to read something fully. Particularly online, this was accompanied by an editorial that was very clear in its purpose. From the first paragraph, you knew where it was headed.
Let's go back to the relationship between the current administration and the press, individual reporters, and how difficult it's been at times. We have seen in the first 2 months certain media outlets barred from White House news conferences, and the White House press secretary at times refusing to take questions from selected members of the press. So Steve, I want to ask you, because you oversee a very large staff of reporters, you issued that memo. What have been the biggest challenges and surprises covering this administration?
Well, the first thing I'd say, just getting back to what Tom had said, and it's related, I actually think this president has a very complicated relationship with the media. You'll notice that after the healthcare plan was defeated, his first two calls were to the New York Times and the Washington Post. So he was reaching out to members of the media he considered to be credible and who he had been criticizing separately. So he may say the media is the enemy of the people. The other thing that's obviously going on is many people in this administration are talking regularly to the media, always on background, even though they claim that anything off the record is fake. Nonetheless, almost all of their communications are likely to be on background, but there's a lot of communication. And in fact, in the previous administration, there was very often criticism that there wasn't great accessibility within departments. Our reporters were often telling me that they didn't have, it was difficult to get access, and the administration was clamping down on access. And both formally and informally, through both leaks and intentional administration statements, there is actually a lot of access to information in this administration. So it's not quite so clear. And I guess what I step back and ask myself is, if a case is brought that limits First Amendment rights, if they go to court to block somebody from publishing a story, from having access to a public hearing, if they go into court to oppose a case that previously would have been case law favorable to the press, and suddenly they're against it, I will be more concerned than if, as part of his rhetorical desire to hype up his base, that he says a lot of negative things about the press. I don't like it. And I think obviously as a member of the media, we certainly don't think we're an enemy of the people. But again, making the global comparison, I worry more in countries where journalists are getting arrested, are getting killed, are getting sued through criminal libel suits, which are very, very dangerous around the world. And we and other journalists face this all over the world, and that hasn't happened here. So I think that's an important preface. We don't know what's going to happen next, and we're not prejudging it, but I think you do have to put it in that context.
I take your material point, but I think there's a cost to our civic life.
I'm not
the president calls the press the enemy of the people.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but when it comes to how you behave as a journalist, so the advocacy organizations in our profession, Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, I'm on the board of both of them. In that capacity, I'm very happy to get very angry about this stuff. In the capacity as a journalist who feels I have responsibility to my reader, I'm more often just going to want to be communicating what I think they need to know about policy, what I think they need to know about what's going on, and less about these issues.
So, Steve, we have a lot of aspiring journalists in this audience. Do you find that this current environment is discouraging a lot of younger journalists, or actually inspiring them to enter this field?
Yeah, no, I've been really excited by how many people are interested in doing journalism. I talk to students in many different schools, and there's real enthusiasm for it. There's enthusiasm to read good journalism, as we've seen by subscriptions going up at most places, and readership going up. The notion that everybody is interested in fake news and not interested in real news, I just think isn't true. Hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people around the world every day are trying to find out what's really going on. And one of my kind of favorite examples, but I think it's really important to think about. Again, I'm not saying this is North Korea, so please don't anybody come to that conclusion. In North Korea, where there's virtually no press freedom, people put their lives on the line and go to enormous lengths to try to find out what's really going on. They smuggle in flash drives, they smuggle in DVDs, they listen to radio, which if they got caught, they'd be in big trouble, because they viscerally know they're not being told the truth, and they want to know the truth. In other countries where there's, let's say, a firewall, people find ways to get around the firewall. So the desire to get good information and understand what's really going on versus what you're being fed is enormous and global, and I think we're underestimating it.
Yes, I agree. I agree that it's a basic urge for most people, and I experienced the same when I traveled in China for a while, that people would try to just ask me what's going on out there. Peter, since you are in radio, you get a lot of interaction with the public. I'm just asking a general question. What do you think are the biggest issues right now that people are bringing up, calling into you about, your staff? What's their biggest concern?
Their biggest concern is balance, is fairness. Most of the calls that I get from the listeners that come to my office, it's about a story, it's about just an overall impression of the radio station. And usually, I think if I'm If I'm annoying an equal number of people on each end of the spectrum, then I think I'm doing okay. But most of them are calling up about a specific story, and usually when they do, I'll, call up the story on my computer and read it back to them and find out what issues they have from them, because sometimes they can teach us something, and that's a good thing. And sometimes they heard it wrong, meaning they didn't actually hear the words we said. They kind of transposed a few words, and they say, oh, that's not the way I heard it on the radio, and I'll call an air check back up of what was said, and they'll say, oh, that's okay. So very often, because it's a background medium in a lot of ways, people are doing things, they're distracted, they're driving, they're beeping the horn at somebody, they're texting, they're not paying as close attention.
Hopefully not texting while they're driving.
Yes. They're not paying as close attention, and so they're not listening as carefully as we would always like them to.
And also not aware, as we were bringing up earlier, of the filters that we carry with us when we get information. Peter, I want to ask you another question about social media. There are benefits. Information is spread more rapidly. In many ways, it is a watchdog itself, because if things happen, they can't be hidden as easily. We usually do find things out first on Twitter. But your thoughts on the use of Twitter by politicians? Overall net good or overall net horrible?
I think overall net good. I think you can line up most of the politicians, and I think they do a fairly decent job with it. I think you can pick a few obvious choices, and you would wish they act more presidential, shall we say, and do a better job of it. But I think the dialogue back and forth is good. I think the ability for the audience to chime in on stories on Facebook or chime in on stories on Twitter or any of the social media platform, I think that feedback is good. I've always equated, for those of us in the newsroom, I think of Twitter as almost as another wire service for us of information to take and consume and filter out and sift out the good and sift out the bad and decide what you can use out of it. But it's a great resource for us because we know what people are saying, and it's become harder and harder and harder to get some politicians on the phone because they just don't respond as much as they used to.
And I think maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but there's an element of crazy in everything, and as long as you are able to recognize that and sort of compartmentalize, that can help. Tom, out of everyone here, you probably discuss and cover culture the most. Many people are getting their information on the Trump administration from the evening comedy shows. Who knew Trump would still be the nightly monologue for Stephen Colbert? What do you think of that impact on political discourse?
I don't know today. I mean, 4, 5, 6 years ago, that was very novel, or 10 years ago it was novel when Jon Stewart was kind of breaking that ground with The Daily Show, and we were all astonished by it. I think my fascination with the impact of the nightly comedy shows has diminished as the much bigger ocean of social media has risen in that same decade. I mean, they're still marvelous interpreters and satirists, and it's fun to see it, and I look at them as another opinion vein, a strong opinion vein, but I think their influence is really challenged now by all kinds of social media. To me, that's where the kind of unpredictable and outside the traditional orthodoxy and outside the mainstream conversations go on now, and sometimes for some people, they define a new mainstream. I think they've been overshadowed. To me, what's really important now is the power of social media, which is, it's a kind of contagion. Is it a contagion of truth or of fake news or alternative facts? It sort of depends how you look at it. It can be manipulated. It has crowd effects, People can stampede in a certain direction. People of a certain political persuasion or a certain bent or bias or predisposition can take some few little grains of information and run off and create a big wave, interpreting the world in a certain way. And it can be very powerful, more powerful than any individual comedian right now. You see it all the time, and it can be manipulated, it can be used. Even presidents can use it. They don't necessarily have to have any facts at all going into their concoctions, but it's potent. And to me, like Peter, this is even more than a news service. I mean, the social media now, they're like waves. They come through, and they come through all the time. Some of them are very big, very impactful, and they can topple the facts all over the place. You have to sort of set all the facts up again and start the conversation again. And it's not, sometimes it's kind of the random, sweaty energy of a crowd, and sometimes it's manipulated and driven, but it's strong.
Well, it's sometimes like trying to take a sip of water from a fire hose.
Yeah, that too.
But what do you think about the satire and the comedy and the fact that we're moving a line? Some people would say that we're moving it higher. A lot of people would say we're moving it lower. Another Yalie, the director of the Samantha Bee, the Full Frontal Samantha Bee show, is also a Yalie. And she wrote recently to some friends that no matter what, they may really push the line, they may be offensive, but they actually research everything to not go away from the facts. How they deliver it on the show and on stage may be shocking, but it's still something that they've researched in the facts. But do you think that this manner and what we have come to regard as normal, either attacks from either side, the use of comedy, do you think that this is hurting the process, the overall process that we should have of getting information and making decisions and having politics, move this country in whatever way it's supposed to move?
I think these kind of comedy satires are a new vein of op-ed. They're a new vein of opinion. If it's based in fact, all the better. It's great. And I think people generally recognize it as such. I don't see that as a real, it's potent, it's powerful, it has made the mainstream news media sort of sit up and think about its delivery and how to keep people's attention, and that's probably a good thing. I'm not so worried about that. I'm more worried about social media or straight up fake news put into the bloodstream of social media deliberately, that is not fact-based, that is meant to mislead, that is sometimes agenda or ideology-driven in a way that has little to do with facts or is even in opposition to the facts, but is deliberate, is architected, is designed, is well-funded, is driven by passion and money, and goals that may have very little to do with the facts and could leave our country sitting askew to reality, and therefore vulnerable and in trouble.
So the most important question of the night that I actually am hoping all of you can answer: how can this be fixed? How can we return to a state where false information falls away, facts rise to the top, and people absorb and listen to these things and make decisions accordingly? Can it be fixed?
They know. I don't know.
I'll let Steve answer this one.
I think it's just by doing what we do better. Just doubling down, putting more critical thought into what we do, requiring that of the audience as well, and making sure that we are fair and balanced, not as a marketing term, but in reality. Those words actually mean something. So just being fair and balanced is not always enough, but it's a good start, and it should be more than just some entity's marketing term.
Steve?
Well, to copy Katie on an earlier point of not accepting the premise entirely, I don't accept the premise entirely. The social media and the internet have provided an opportunity to have more facts at our fingertips than we've ever had in the history of the universe. Any individual can go online and find out and research anything in great depth, can go to original documents, can go to archives, can find out things that you would have had to travel the world to find out, and can fact check and verify things by going to original documents and finding out what's really going on. So I don't think the answer is to kind of turn back the clock on technology. Technology is technology. We now have the ability, presidents and everybody else has the ability to go directly to the public. They don't need us as an intermediary. And people have the ability to say anything they want on social media. But there's a lot of good things that come of it, which is the amazing universe of information and facts available on the web, and the ability, if people have some news literacy, which is something a lot of people are talking about, doing more training in news literacy, to check. Also, technology can help. There are algorithmic verification tools. Reuters has created one where you both use technology and people together to quickly see what's going on Twitter and come up with a very high likelihood of whether it's true or not based on lots and lots of indications that you can get just using technology, and that will get better and stronger. So I think we'll have opportunities to move forward in a pretty good way, but we're not going to move backwards to a time when the media just told people what the facts were and what to think, because people have more tools at their disposal to challenge and test things and go back and forth. But look how well Wikipedia works. When somebody puts something on Wikipedia that is inaccurate, the community swarms on it and challenges it and very often corrects it. So there's a self-correcting element to social media that I think we've to some degree undersold in the conversation.
I wish Facebook were as good as Wikipedia at that.
Well, they vow that they're going to make some changes, correct? So we'll see. Katie, do you have any thoughts?
I'm not so confident in the self-correcting thing. We're in a difficult time, and we're challenged in new ways. Economically, we're challenged as a country like we haven't been challenged in many decades. Climatologically, we're challenged, and we don't want to accept it because it may require us to change our lives. We're no longer the top dog necessarily in the world. The demographic of the country has changed. It's diverse, and there's a lot of people who are uncomfortable with that still, though in a city like Boston, you may think, oh, what's the big deal? This is great. And I agree that it's great, but not everybody feels the same way. And there are people with the will to power who see discomfited citizens who aren't happy with a lot of realities and are willing to offer them alternative facts and fake news that are BS to win their allegiance and thereby win power. And I'm not so sure that it's self-correcting. It's not 1965 when the American economy is kind of rolling along and we will recenter over our values automatically because the world is kind of aligned in the sweet spot for this country and all of its presumptions and even prejudices. I mean, I know you know this, but I'm a little more worried about, clearly we have politicians who have identified the potential of pushing false narratives to successfully propel them into power. And this is a big deal. And now some are turning around to attack those who would try to bring an objective view. And I'm not saying they're always perfect or correct, but this, to me, we're off kilter right now. And I'm not sure that we'll recenter over facts and values that we value.
So just a quick, if I could just respond quickly. I don't vastly disagree with your concern or with your concern about where the country is, but I would say that ultimately more jobs will come back to this country or they won't. Ultimately, people will have health care that they need or they won't. And they'll figure that out because it'll affect their lives. And so I'm not sure the false narrative is what got them to vote the way they voted. I think what got them to vote the way they voted was they were voting their life experience, which was a middle class in decline for 15 years.
Truth is in there too, no question.
And that I think that part of the sorting process is to see what happens. And when people see the facts on the ground, either positive towards what the president is saying he's going to do or negative, that their own reactions will change based on their own facts, and it's too soon to know that.
True. It's just that ultimately can be a long time.
Yeah, no, I recognize that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you both are discussing much bigger questions than adjusting an algorithm on Facebook. I mean, these are large challenges that the country faces, and the false narratives, there's a reason that they took root. It's because people had genuine needs and desires from their politicians, and Donald Trump had a message that they could grab onto and that made sense to them and that felt like leadership. And so, I think that is probably the bigger question that we need to pose is why was that the case? What needs to happen in our country that makes those people feel like their needs are being addressed?
I think there's an additional concern that we need to keep in mind with this. If the jobs come back or not, if these things come back or not, that we don't have it shift, if there's a failure in some of these goals, that there is then a blame game that is created. Because, say, the jobs don't come back, but instead it is blamed on something else that creates an even more negative cycle. I think Tom and I see this from traveling in places that had regimes where failures in policy were blamed specifically on really innocent groups.
But people are expecting the president to solve these problems. They know they voted for him to solve these problems. If he doesn't, I think they'll react rationally to that, but that's to be seen.
Well, the media has to stay
That may
open.
be part of the self-correcting process.
Right, or if the Democrats look at this election and figure out how to create their own narratives. And I think that is one of the things that as journalism organizations that we also have to take into account. There is this rise of resistance right now in our country. Someone needs to be covering them too, because the same levels of corruption and false narratives can erupt as easily.
Interesting.
But one thing that won't fix all this is if the media thinks if everything's okay in Boston, everything's okay in the country. If everything's okay in my little corner or in the newsroom where I still have a job, then everybody else is probably all right. I mean, the media has to look at this with really open eyes. There are reasons there was deep dissatisfaction.
There are a lot of bubbles we're talking about, not just geographical, but also this. So let me ask you, Katie, very quickly before we open up to questions from the audience. You're talking about areas of resistance. Well, Boston, New England is seen as an area of resistance, partly because how we are skewed politically and also because in the narrative that's out there that the coastal elites and the educated are living in a different way. Talk about how you've seen the impact of the local reporters and the local media outlets here and the effect on the national scene.
I agree with you that I think that, Boston has a long history of being a leader on certain social issues. You think of things like marriage equality, healthcare reform, education, accountability, revolution. Go way back. I was just going to the 90s. I think that honestly, that doesn't impact our newsroom at all. We cover these protests. We cover both sides of the aisle equally and fairly as much as we can. And our newsroom is obviously covering things like the Women's March. We dedicated a large number of staffers both here and Boston.
I'm talking about how it's not just this market that's following the Globe. The Globe is now being, I find, referenced more and more often, as are other regional outlets on the national scene.
Oh, well, I think that's only for the good, right? I think if there's anything that is positive that's come out of this election is that there's a larger conversation amongst media about covering local and regional news more in depth. It's about things like, why are there so many state houses in this country that have so few reporters in them? Why are there large swaths of the country in places like the Midwest, where my family's from and I know Tom is from, that don't have local media outlets that are sustainable anymore? Why are so much of the media concentrated on the coasts and trying to put money behind that? The Washington Post is a great example of that. The New York Times has expanded their number of people outside of New York. I'm sure Reuters already has a very healthy number of reporters. The AP, places like Univision. There is a push, a recognition that there is parts of this country that are not being reported on as aggressively as they should be and don't have a regular media presence. And I think that's only a positive. That'll only be better for our civic conversation.
We want to open up for questions from the audience. So there is a mic here on each aisle. So feel free to come up if you have a question.
Ready.
Yes. Go ahead.
Sure. So my name's Nicholas. I'm a junior here at Emerson College. My question for you all is on amateur journalism. I would never trust the four of you to give me heart surgery because I'd want someone who's qualified and trained physically and ethically. Obviously, no offense. But I'm not always that selective when you look at news outlets and journalists. And in the age where kind of anyone can take to a keyboard and become a journalist, is that in your mind doing? If there is such a thing as amateur journalism, is that doing such a thing to grow the flow of information, or is it adding to the fake news phenomenon?
Well, I'll take it. I don't really like the term fake news. To me, it should be called fiction. News is news, and I think, for any journalist, I think that you don't like the association of the word fake with it. That said, I think the people who get behind a keyboard and maybe practice amateur journalism, I think people tend to get a little bit brave behind a keyboard and type what they want to type and send it along their way. And some of them are very responsible, some are good at it, some of them could have a career in journalism. I think some of them are arsonists, and they just like to throw the fire out there and watch it burn like an arsonist would. So the buyer has to beware.
I mean, one thing I'd say is we do have witnesses. You sort of call it amateur journalism. You could also call it witnesses with a cell phone camera, and that's actually very valuable. I mean, a lot of the news that comes in first because somebody on the spot who wasn't a journalist, who wasn't a professional journalist, took a picture of it and circulated it. And so we do have a much wider user-generated content. We have a much wider range of information. Now, I would then filter that through a professional set of standards to make sure it's an authentic photograph, to make sure it's actually where the person said it is. But it's very valuable to have people with cameras all over the world taking pictures.
Well, citizens capture that essential understanding of what's important about conveying facts that they happen to have some special advantage on, and they have more mechanisms for sharing those now than ever. That's pretty awesome, actually.
And I will say, having worked so many years in a newsroom, generally speaking, never is this stuff made up. People do call in with real information. The fake news is a business. If you watch 60 Minutes, it's people profiting from creating outlandish stories because they are actually getting money from the views. Let's take a question from over here.
Hi, my name's Trip Clemens, Emerson, class of 13. First of all, thanks for gracing our stage with your presence. The question that I have, I was thinking about, Peter, when you said that, we've hit the mark when we get complaints equally from both sides of the spectrum. And that got me thinking, is the quest that you're on to sort of find the relative center, or is it to find the truth? And that led me to thinking, what are the market forces that you're faced with as an individual and the organizations that you're working for that are forcing you to think more about the financial sustainability and less about the truth? So that market force number one is appealing to people's entrenched opinions that they're approaching your journalism with, the preconceived before they read what you have to say. Market force number two that I'm noticing is shortened attention spans. So I heard on Terry Gross's NPR last week, for example, that a decade ago, human had 12 seconds of attention span. Now it's 8. A goldfish has 9. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about those two, feel free to add to the list. I'm sure it's a lot longer than just 2, but speak a little bit about the market forces that you're faced with and how you have to appeal to changing audiences.
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. Those of us in, say, commercial radio and newspapers and television, we're all basically doing journalism in an industry that survives off of advertising. And the advertising model isn't as strong as it used to be. The digital side is growing. The regular ad sales side is a little bit down in some, flat as the new up in some others. So I think the business model for journalism has changed over the last 5 years. We see more nonprofit journalistic organizations. There's a handful of really good ones here in the Boston area that are doing good journalism work. Commonwealth Magazine, the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, both nonprofit organizations that are out doing doing really good journalism. They don't have as wide an audience, but more of those groups are popping up, and hopefully it'll spread so that the rest of the world, the rest of the region here is getting that good journalism. What was the other point?
I think you kind of spoke to the two that I was asking about, but my question is really just if those market forces are a factor from the very concept of a story.
So I think one of the things that we've seen in the last 3 months, and Steve alluded to this earlier, is that we actually have seen a lot more people willing to pay for news. I can speak mostly for the Boston Globe, but several other publications have seen this. We've seen a spike in subscriptions, and we've seen more and more people coming to our website, which doesn't solve the industry problems that you describe. I think that we in our newsroom are always talking about how to best reach the reader. What platform should a story live on? Should it be Instagram story? Should it be a traditional 800-word story? Should it be a video, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that gets to the second part of your question about attention spans. And what we know is we have data now that shows us exactly how long someone sticks with a story. How can we learn from that and make sure that we're delivering in a news in a way that actually truly engages the reader?
And what's interesting is that the Boston Globe has increased, because I read it religiously, incredible and beautiful long-form stories. I mean long-form stories on trolley crashes and individual cases of a child that was adopted years ago. And they are getting a lot of views, and people are talking about them.
This is a good question. If you're in broadcast journalism, if you're honest with yourself, you know that in the last 20 years, many huge successes have come from broadcasters who have gone very political, gone very partisan, very, very full of attitude, and very agenda-driven. And you can, if you go for a narrow but fervent audience, you can build a very big audience. Ask Rush Limbaugh, ask Bill O'Reilly, ask Laura Ingraham, right on down the line. So you know that, you're aware of that. So it's been a period where it's been very important to be rooted in real journalistic, true, deep journalistic values. On the other hand, I think right now that we may be at some tipping point on that. You saw the other night when Sean Hannity asked Ted Koppel, do you think, I forget what the exact words were, but do you think I'm bad for the country? Yeah. And Ted Koppel said yes, straight in his face. And I think there's some tipping point. I think, to Steve's point, I think there is a point at which people see things getting kind of crazy, and they want to get back to real factual reporting as close as we can come. And hopefully that's speaking on the other shoulder of all journalists right now.
Okay.
Barry Lanson, journalism faculty. Apologies, students, for hogging the mic. Quick question for all the panelists. In your view, are news media outlets spending too much time covering Donald Trump's tweets? If not, why not? If so, what else should they be doing with that time instead?
I think it's calmed down a little bit now. I think when he was first tweeting, after he first took office, everybody was jumping over the fence. And I think it has calmed down a little bit now, not quite enough for my personal taste, but I think it has calmed down just a little bit. But I think sometimes we have been spending too much time on his tweets, and I wish we wouldn't.
I think it's one of the things that I've been asking myself is, Twitter is a really small platform. There aren't that many people on it. So when the Boston Globe or Reuters or NBC News covers, or CNN covers his tweets, we're actually amplifying them in a way that we have to take into consideration. That said, he's the president. We have to cover his tweets. This is the way he communicates with the American public. And I actually think that we have a bigger obligation to cover his tweets from that side. That's where I've come down on it. If we weren't covering his, but then again, some of the best stories that come out of DC always, no matter who the administration are people who are getting outside of the briefing room, the people who are digging through agencies and collecting. I mean, the other thing that we've seen is that there's a lot of leaks from this administration.
Very leaky.
And that is you always have to take that information and verify it and understand the context that it's being given in and all of those caveats. But, those are the stories that we should be chasing.
And Steve, you actually said this administration was far leakier than Obama's administration. Is that what you felt?
They're just more willing to talk to the media, correct?
Sure. It's not so much leaking, it's that they are generally more available. I mean, the way I would look at the tweets, when it would be traditional practice among journalists, if the president said something, you would report it, and if he or she someday said something that that seemed to matter in terms of policy, it would be a big story because this is the most powerful person in the world. So I think there's had to be, and it's been perfectly fair for that to happen, an evolution in thinking about, okay, but is this tweet actually a statement that affects policy? Is it a statement that's actually going to be of consequence, or is it like a side comment on a golf course? And so I think our news judgment has had to evolve to understand, is this a tweet of, is this a statement by the President of the United States of consequence, or something that's kind of a side statement that's probably not of a lot of consequence? And I think that's almost like any news judgment, which figuring out how important is it. You'd start by saying anything a president says is very important, and then I think you start thinking a little harder about it as you understand that he's doing it very frequently and sometimes on matters that aren't of consequence.
They still go to the character and the governing temperament of the head of state of this country. And I mean, I think the press is big enough, thank God still, to walk and chew gum at the same time. You can cover tweets and also really cover substantive policy issues, but to ignore them, this is the dude in the White House. Yeah. And you can't ignore the effusions.
Also, there's something else at play here. When you think about how technology affects the country, how we find out information. 200 years ago, people would wait months and months and months for messages to be carried out by people on horseback and, put on a scroll and hung on the side of a building on a tree, and so people could read about it. And a lot of what drove the election results were people not feeling connected, right, to their leaders. And something about Twitter is that you may be one of 26 million, but you feel a direct connection. You are linked to each other. You follow this person. And I've heard people really read these things as if it's a message directly to them. And that is also something that you cannot ignore. So when you're talking about it covering or not, sometimes it doesn't have to be covered. It's what people are talking about. And so we think it's being covered all the time.
I mean, to me, the question is how big a story is any given tweet. So it's more a judgment as to how big a deal. And are you going to spend a day on the tweet, or you spend 3 days on the tweet, or are you going to write 3 paragraphs that said, oh, the president said this, and you're going to move on? So I think.
But it also can be a matter of record, right? We can look at a tweet and say, okay, this was promised, this was said, this is what happened.
Right. And just like every other news story, it always depends on what else is going on.
Your question?
Hi, Sean Praval. My question was to Peter, because earlier you said that you wish, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you wish that Facebook had a self-curating kind of environment like Wikipedia does, but you also said that... I think I said I wish
Facebook was better at it.
Yeah, better at it. But you also said that we as media consumers should be more careful about what we read and do more research. Which do you think would be the better approach? Because as I understand, Facebook is just...
Other than both?
Other than both.
I would say you be a better consumer. You be a better, more educated, more judicious consumer of news. And just, make sure you vet whoever it is that you're listening to, and make sure you listen to the opinions and the product from the other side of the spectrum, so that you know what they're saying about the argument that your side is making. And it makes you more well-rounded. It's like cross-training for your brain.
All right, your question?
Hi, Tito from Upstatement, local design firm, works with a lot of media. We've actually did WBUR's website and the Boston Globe's website. So my question, we've been talking a lot about your thoughts from the positions that you occupy now at large traditional news organizations. I wanted to ask if I were a VC and I were giving you guys a blank check to start a brand new news organization that would be optimized for this climate and the state of affairs that we see right now, what would you guys do? Who would your audience be? What would your mission be? Where would you be located geographically? How would you start something brand new?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Good question.
Steve?
Second time Tom has abdicated.
Yeah. There was a woman online, I think her name was Melody Kramer, who had written something similar like that, and she listed a whole bunch of things. And I looked at it today, actually, and I thought, this would take me like 6 months to answer all these questions and really put the thought into it. I think if I was going to start an online journalism organization today, given that video drives the numbers on the internet, it would have to be primarily a video-based one, but I would really want everybody who worked there to be a multi-platform journalist who could do anything and do everything. And so can we branch off into print and radio and everything else from there? Sure, absolutely. That would be a great, phase 2, phase 3 goal. But primarily, I'd probably start something as a video organization, because that's what drives traffic on the website. And in order to have any success, you need to be able to have people see it. I mean, the first newspaper in the country was started right here in Boston. I forget the year it was, but it was called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. It only lasted one issue. So you got to reach the ears and the eyeballs in order to make whatever you do successful.
So my answer is I would recreate Reuters, because I think we have all the elements. But other than Reuters, just thinking about like who's out there that largely reflects where I think we should be going. And I think an organization like ProPublica is very much on the model I would be looking at, because ProPublica, which is an investigative news organization that is funded by basically philanthropists who want to fund good journalism, but it's independent from the philanthropists. The virtue of it is it practices extremely rigorous journalism, where they really are trying to get to the bottom of things, and they're doing good journalism, and they're being fair, and they're partnering with many, many other organizations to get reach. So they'll do something with the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post or NPR or NBC. So they'll do this great reporting. They'll partner with somebody who has dramatic reach, and they'll try to get the stories out as broadly as possible, but again, with tremendously high standards. I'm just really impressed by their standards. And one of the reasons they're getting so much funding right now, and they're getting way more funding, is that people recognize there's this huge need for that. People to go out there, get to the bottom of things, but do it through rigorous journalism and not just by taking like opinionated journalism. So I think that's a great model.
I would add, the other thing about ProPublica, which is extremely impressive, is that they have been so experimental in their storytelling and the storytelling tools that they use. They have done amazing investigations in which the end product is a database that you can look up by zip code. Who are the doctors that are, doing malpractice and things like that. When they do their projects, they really think about the end user and how they're going to consume that news and how they can best tell that story in a way that will have the reach that you're describing, of course paired with fantastically rigorous journalism.
And the information often persists. It's evergreen. It has use months, years sometimes after it's written. Okay, we only have 5 minutes left.
Stand on its own.
Yeah.
I do ProPublica in a very sexy outfit, with very tight cycle, news like constantly, not just the big thing, like a pyramid. So up at the top, it's like so fast and so sexy, and then the deeper you go into it, the deeper the stories are. But the top, informed by the truths discovered down in the deep reporting. If you want it to work commercially, I think that's the way.
When you said outfit, I said that's so not radio.
Baby,
Yeah.
so sexy.
Yeah, Tom. sexy part up top. Yeah, I said so not radio when he said sexy outfit. Okay, we only have 5 minutes left.
Radio's
and
the sexiest thing
you're
going.
sartorially just on point tonight. We only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you that we're going to optimize because I want to get all of your questions. So ask a tight question, and we're going to have tight answers. So go on.
Do you want to go to that side
your
first?
turn. I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry. Hi, I'm Izzy. I'm a freshman here. So to give some context, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Kansas until I moved here last fall, and it's definitely like a less pro-media environment, to say the least there. So I'm interested more, you guys have kind of touched on this, if you think that your organizations have any responsibility in all of these people that are turning to fake news instead of traditional media sources. And I do understand you talked a little bit, Catherine, about how the media had a bunch of like long form pieces about, like, say, the Iowa factory worker or the West Virginia coal miner, but is that like representation really enough, like these long pieces about these individuals, or do you guys think it could possibly be more about like the actual issues that are being covered in a small article or that are just on the front page? When someone looks at the front page and they don't see any of the issues that they care about, do you think that that maybe could be part of the reason that they're so turned off of traditional media?
Yeah, I think you're actually getting to the heart of the point that I was trying to make, which is that I think that a lot of news organizations pride themselves in covering communities that are downtrodden. I mean, we don't have to go to the Midwest. We can go to Western Massachusetts or Fall River and large swaths of the state. The issue is exactly how you put it. Why are we not reaching them? Why don't they look at the front page and see their own lives reflected there? I absolutely agree.
Don't be snooty. Don't talk down. Yeah. Don't be oblivious to their problems. And don't be tonally the other all the time. Coastal people in particular, watch out for that, right?
I'm a freshman here at Emerson. So you used the phrase buyer beware, and I think we could agree that it's on the reader or the listener to filter their own information. But is it the responsibility of your media organizations to develop, support, and spread curriculum in media literacy?
I didn't hear the last bit. Is it the responsibility
of your organizations to develop or support or spread curriculum in media literacy? Like, is this an initiative that should be sent to public high schools or even middle schools?
I would love it if they already had the curriculum there in public high schools and in college, but I think it's our responsibility to do journalism in a good way and set the example by doing so.
And it's your responsibility to read. Okay. All right.
Hi, I'm Ziva. I'm a junior political communications major at Emerson. You mentioned earlier that voters will eventually decide whether Trump's policies work or not, if we get jobs or not, if we get health care or not, et cetera. So regarding last week and the failed bill that was withdrawn from the House regarding AHCA, there's been some polls put out already. Admittedly, it's early, but it said that overwhelmingly neither the president nor Speaker Ryan have been blamed for the failure. And you mentioned that voters will eventually blame the person who is in charge of this, which is the President of the United States. So how do you see that playing out? Because right now it looks as though the voters really aren't blaming the president for this failure, regardless of whether you see it as a failure or victory or not.
Well, the fact that it didn't pass didn't immediately cost people insurance, and in fact, it probably saved a lot of people's insurance. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the way it would play out politically would be if something was put into effect, let's say by Republicans, and it turned out to have an actual negative effect on the lives of millions of people. They're not going to not notice that. They're going to notice that. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with maybe a border tax or whether or not various protectionist policies go through. That's either going to help them get more jobs or it isn't going to help them get more jobs. And yes, it's going to take a year or two probably for anybody to know that. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of people voted for Trump on the hope that somebody outside the current system would just do something radically different, because neither, as far as people were concerned, neither party had addressed their issues in ways that mattered to them in their lives. And so they're now taking a gamble that this will make a positive difference. And if it does, I think they'll be favorable. And if it doesn't, ultimately, they'll be really negative. But again, it's less than 100 days into the administration, so it's too hard to know it's too soon to know most of those things yet.
Your question?
Hi. If the goal of news is to stay in the middle and to not lean towards a political party, what do you do when the truth is inherently leaning towards the left or the right?
I don't think our job is to stay exactly in the middle. Our job is to provide balance. So like a good police investigator, let's see where that balance takes us. So if the balance takes us in one direction, then so be it, but you got to present the other side. But I don't think that we're trying to be, walk a fine line and never go off there. I think we have to go where the story goes and let it take us there, but also not do it with blinders on.
I think there's a mistaken understanding that being unbiased means you just do he said, she said, so-called false equivalency, and you leave it at that. And it's not at all, at least what I mean by it. What I mean by being unbiased is trying really to get at the facts and really understand them. And if a reasonable person would conclude that those facts point you clearly in one direction, that's absolutely fine. I don't think that makes us biased. But our job is not to try to twist the facts to support a pre-existing position, but rather to present them honestly. And if, when you see them, it's perfectly clear to you that one side is right and the other side is wrong, then we've done our job, if that's the conclusion you reach. But it's not just having an equal number of people say yes or no. That's not good journalism. That's kind of stenography, and I don't support that.
Yeah, especially when we live in a state like Massachusetts, and if the president and his current administration does something and you want to get some reaction from it, from your local delegation, they're all Democrats here. So you're going to have to look long and hard before you can find a dissenting opinion if you're going to stick with a local delegation for reaction.
Hi, I'm Kayla Martin. I'm a freshman journalism major here at Emerson. And during the first few weeks of classes, one of my professors said every day, there's one question you need to ask yourself as a journalist. What do people need to know versus what do people want to know? And how do you choose your stories based on what's most important for people to know?
Well, there's a lot of important stories we don't cover every day. It's our job when we sit down and decide what stories we're going to do each day is to provide a balance of the different types of stories, not only balance on each individual story, but a balance on the types of stories that we're going to cover for that day. So what's going on out there for the day? What is there to cover? What other stories are we working on that aren't necessarily news conferences or events that we're going to go just send a reporter and a tape recorder and get a bunch of talking heads talking about something. So we need to provide a full balanced diet so that all of our stories just don't sound the same.
But let me reiterate the point that something that's been brought up repeatedly is that each person must act as an editor. It's that garbage in, garbage out principle that applies to a computer. You have to watch and see and choose what you are choosing to consume. If your Twitter feed is Kardashian heavy and you're really not looking at the sources that are going to provide information on healthcare and other important issues, you can't then be angry that you're not finding out what you need to know. If you look, most of the information is out there and it's accessible and it's your responsibility. Do you have closing thoughts on where we stand today? I know some people describe this time as dangerous, some people describe it as just dicey or disturbing. What are your thoughts on where we're going to go in the next 100 days, or maybe the next 4 years, I should say?
Who knows?
God knows. Every day is an adventure. I want to be fair, always fair, and I feel ready to fight for facts, for the truth as best we can figure it out, for the freedom to express those. Sort of some combination of fairness and readiness to fight for freedom of speech and facts. That's where I feel balanced tonight.
Katie?
I would probably echo those sentiments exactly. We as journalists, we know what our job is, and we're going to keep doing it and fight for facts and making sure that people have the information that they need to be good citizens.
I would just say it's the best time ever to be a journalist. We're really being called upon to perform a service, and there's amazingly important things to write about and to broadcast about and to tweet about, and I recommend the field. It's a great field.
I agree with everybody, and I would say that the best thing about my job is that no 2 days are the same, and that you never stop learning. You never stop learning how to do the job better, and you never stop having fun, because, I mean, it's fun to cover this president. So, it's a good path. It's a rewarding path. I would encourage everybody who's a student here, everybody who's into journalism, and you're looking to get into journalism, then put the pedal down and keep going full speed ahead, and find a job that you can learn every day something new and learn how to do the job better every day, and then you'll make this a better country.
And never forget, we do have a democracy, a great one, and you are part of that, an important role. Thank you so much. This has been an incredible evening, and thank you for attending.